It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. It's time to call your senator with our monthly Call Your Senator segment. My questions and yours for New Jersey Senator Andy Kim. New Jersey residents' first priority, but anyone may call or text 212-433 WNYC 212-433-9692. Call us or text us. Among the topics I'll raise, the state of the war changing again in the last day. You know, Senator Kim used to be a Pentagon and State Department and White House National Security Council official, and he's currently the ranking member on the Senate's National Security and International Trade Subcommittee. So that seems relevant to the Strait of Hormuz, right? And he's got opinions. I'll also ask, should New Jersey and other blue states get even more aggressive about partisan redistricting after the Supreme Court decision last week, further enabling that? Governor Sherrill says she's open to trying to box out some of the 3 Republican House members from the state and more. How about you? What have you got for Senator Kim? Ask your questions. 212-433 WNYC 212-433-9692. You can call us or you can text us. And Senator, we always appreciate that you do this. Welcome back to WNYC.
Yeah, good morning, Brian.
Let's start with the war. President Trump announced a plan for the U.S. to provide military escorts to oil tankers and other commercial ships to allow them to go through the Strait of Hormuz. Then last night, after just one day, he paused that mission, saying it's because of progress in peace talks with Iran. Do you buy that that's the reason?
No, I definitely don't. I mean, let's just take a step back and just see how much of a mess this is. I mean, we are having a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. Our own service members, 15,000 service members were attached to that operation that you were talking about to escort and support commercial vessels going through the strait. By the way, the vast majority of those not American vessels. So again, our service members put in harm's way because of these problems. Remember, this is not a problem that we had 2 months ago. You know, we did not have a problem with the Strait of Hormuz with commercial vessels going through there. This is all of Trump's making. So we're just trying to get back to where we were 2 months ago. And I just find this to be outrageous that we've spent tens of billions of dollars in this war already. The American people have spent over $32 billion more in gas and diesel just in the last 2 months alone. And when I talked with a woman back in New Jersey, talking about how she's living paycheck to paycheck, you know, she said this line that just really stuck out to me. She just said, "What about us? You know, what about us? Who's looking out for us?" And I just think that is so clearly what stands out to me is that we have a president that's spending his time at his golf resorts, you know, hosting golf tournaments while we have this war going on, and he doesn't seem to care at all about how the American people are doing.
So that's your big picture Democratic member of the Senate take. I get it. But on this specific thing, only a few ships had so far taken the U.S. up on its escort offer, still apparently fearing that they would be attacked by Iran. Why do you think there was that little confidence in the U.S.'s ability to actually protect them in this particular mission?
Well, because we saw that even U.S. vessels going through the Strait of Hormuz were shot at. And that the United States just the other day had to sink 6 Iranian boats. And it's not just American vessels. You know, the UAE got hit and continued strikes. Like, you know, this is not a ceasefire in the way that I understood it when I engaged in diplomacy before, and especially when the United States, you know, says they're entering a ceasefire, but then engages in a naval blockade, which is an act of war. So, I mean, the United States is engaged in an act of war right now. And when the president tries to make it seem like that's not the case and that he doesn't have to report to Congress, he doesn't need congressional approval, like, that's all a lie. Like, we are at war right now, and this president still hasn't come before the American people through Congress for approval. So that's why others are not buying into what Trump is saying, is because they know that what he's saying isn't true. You know, he's saying that America holds all the cards. Well, sure doesn't look like we are holding all the cards here when, when so many ships, say over 1,000 ships, are still not willing to traverse the Strait of Hormuz, when our ships are getting fired upon, when we're seeing gas prices, hitting, $4.20, $4.30 and up. So that's the problem. Trump lives in his separate reality, but it's one completely divorced from what the rest of us are going through.
Here's a clip of Secretary of State Marco Rubio yesterday declaring that Operation Epic Fury, as they have called this war, is concluded because we achieved the objectives. This is Rubio, 30 seconds.
Operation Epic Fury is concluded. We achieved the objectives of that operation. I'm not going to, we're not cheering for an additional situation to occur. We would prefer the path of peace. What the president would prefer is a deal. He would prefer to sit down, work out a memorandum of understanding for future negotiations that touches on all the key topics that have to be addressed, a full opening of the strait so the world can get back to normal. He preferred that be negotiated through the route that Steve and Jared have been working and that all of us have been supporting. That's the route he prefers. That is so far not the route that Iran has chosen.
So before we get to some listener questions, Senator, I found that little part of his news conference yesterday very interesting for a few reasons. Mm-hmm. One is declaring Operation Epic Fury concluded and the objectives achieved, even though Iran still has the same enriched uranium as before. I thought that was objective number one. The radical theocracy is still in power, and in addition, the strait is now closed, as we've been discussing, which it wasn't prior to the war. So what did you make of that claim that the objectives have been achieved? Why would he even say that?
Yeah, look, it reminded me that around 2 months after the start of the 2003 Iraq War, George W. Bush, stood on an aircraft carrier with the banner "Mission Accomplished" behind it. That's what this sounds like to me. Again, about 2 months in, this administration is trying to spin this and say that this is mission accomplished. And, again, the American people are not buying it because they're seeing gas prices continue to be so far above where they were before, with no sense of relief in the future. When we are seeing constantly, just the continued problems of this. And the fact that, again, right now, if you look at what's happening in Iran, basically is run by the IRGC Quds Force now. Now, the most battle-hardened terrorist extremist element of Iran is essentially running that country. And so for them to say that we're better off now, that is not the case. So that's what I hear when I hear Secretary Rubio spinning those lies to the American people.
The reporter's question Rubio was answering there was about the War Powers Act. We didn't include the question. But I'm thinking he didn't declare the conflict with Iran over altogether. He just said that the Operation Epic Fury, is concluded. Maybe that was to start the 60-day clock again before the law requires Congress to vote to continue any military operation under the War Powers Act. Do you think it was legalese in that respect that we were listening to in that clip?
Well, no, Brian, it is not legalese because this war is illegal to start with. So what I want to make clear to you and to those listening is that the 60-day clock doesn't count in this circumstance. You can't stop a clock when it shouldn't have started in the first place. This war is illegal, and it does not qualify for what is under the War Powers Act. This is a full-fledged war. This is war in the constitutional sense, and as a result, needs an approval from Congress. We are not in a circumstance, nor should we normalize the idea that a president can start whatever war that they want, and then it's up to Congress, through the War Powers Act, to disapprove of it. That is not how our Constitution is written. So I just want to make clear, like all this talk about the 60-day clock that this administration keeps going down, that is not the case here in this circumstance. There is no amount of talk that they can do that makes this qualify for what's under the War Powers Act. It is just simply illegal. It was illegal on day 1. It is illegal on day 60. It is illegal on day 68, which is where we're at right now.
One more follow-up on the clip, because another thing that I keyed on was Rubio saying rather than keep fighting, the president would like to see, quote, a memorandum of understanding for future negotiations. A memorandum of understanding, is all he said, for future negotiations. That suggests to me that Trump is eager enough to really conclude these operations because they're unpopular with the midterms coming up, that they're willing to end the war with not an end to Iran's nuclear program or an end to support by Iran for Hezbollah and other proxies, but merely, quote, a memorandum of understanding for future negotiations. Do you think I'm reading too much into that?
No, you're reading it just right. I mean, this is, just again, the capitulation. And sadly, this is where it was always likely to land. I mean, remember where Trump was on day one. I mean, he was talking about regime change. He was talking about toppling, the Iranian regime. He's only just made it stronger in many ways in terms of the grip that they have over the Iranian people. And so, what they're trying to do right now clearly is just trying to find some type of off ramp where they can try to save face. But again, that doesn't help the American people that just spend billions more, to be able to, just live their lives, as well as the long term damage that's being done. So it just feels like, look, like tens of billions of dollars. What do we get out of this other than some potential MOU for a pinky promise for future talks?
And yet, most of the Republicans in the Senate as well as in the House continue to support the war. So here's a listener question. Listener who's obviously a Democrat writes, what is Senator Kim's belief about why the political failure of President Trump is not changing the behavior of Republicans in Congress? And so that references his declining poll numbers, certainly low approval rating for the war. And the listener wants to know, why isn't that changing the behavior of Republicans in Congress?
Yeah, look, I hope it will. And certainly, like I've talked to a number of colleagues in the Senate that do have a young Republican side that do have concerns. At least they say it to me in private. And I'm hopeful that they're going to say this out loud, but I'm not going to just hold my breath because I've seen this time and time again. I mean, look, what I constantly see is that right now, Trump has the ability to weigh in on pretty much any primary election in the Republican Party and try to sway one way or another. He is able to muscle and shame people. He's not afraid to attack, even his own party online. That's the kind of stuff that they're trying to avoid. I think many of them are. The other thing I'll just say is there are many Republicans in Congress that are just completely in lockstep with this president and will never end up saying anything about him because they just are part of, you know, that MAGA world. And I've seen a lot more of that over the last 7 years than when I started in Congress. And so, that is the problem that we're in right now. We do not have three functioning branches of government anymore, certainly not right now. We have one branch of government, the executive branch, that is literally just trying to dominate the other two branches. And Speaker Johnson, in particular, is letting him do it. It just, that is the kind of abdication of leadership that makes me so sad and disheartened to see, about what is supposed to be the Article 1 branch of the United States government.
Let me read you two comments from listeners and ask you to address them as a set. Mm-hmm. One says, no president has ever agreed that they're subject to the War Powers Act. It's not about Trump. It's a more systemic issue. Another one says, love Andy Kim, but he needs to get past his outrage around Trump's hypocrisy. We get it. Now what? So what do you say to either of those?
Yeah, no, look, I mean, what I'll say is, I'm certainly focused on trying to figure out how we get out of this. So, I am very well going to, continue to express my deep concerns about what Trump is doing, but try to figure out a way forward. I'm the only career State Department officer, in Congress right now. I have been working diligently to try to figure out how we can structure these negotiations to be able to get out of this, to be able to find a way forward. And so, I just want to assure people that, I feel strongly about this. I can't just be saying, I don't agree with Trump's might makes right foreign policy. The question then is, what next? Well, what do we want to do? How do we want to rebuild our diplomacy and our foreign policy? I just gave, some remarks in New Jersey talking about the way forward. not just right now, but going forward as well. Like, what are the next couple of years going to entail for us as we have lost so much credibility both abroad and here at home? So that is, that is certainly something that I feel strongly about. And Brian, can you remind me what the other question was?
It was that no president has ever agreed that
Yeah.
they're subject to the War Powers Act. So maybe you're making this too partisan by making it about Trump.
Yeah. So here's what I'll say is every president is constrained by the Constitution. And that's what I'm talking about. I'm actually saying right now that the War Powers Act doesn't actually apply in this circumstance. So, in some ways, I agree with that listener that, that this particular case, this is not a circumstance where the president is constrained because he is constrained by the Constitution. And the Constitution specifically says that Congress has the ability to declare war. Even after 9/11, even after September 11th, the such a clear case of attack on the United States and self-defense of the United States, President George W. Bush still came to Congress for an authorization of the use of military force, which is a modern day declaration of war. So, again, I'm not asking Trump to do things that other presidents haven't done. I'm asking him to do things that the Constitution demands. And that is something that has constrained every single president since the founding of this country.
John, on the Lower East Side, you're on WNYC with Senator Andy Kim. Hi, John.
Hi, good morning, Brian. Senator Kim, my question is, I haven't heard from the Democratic side, what is the ultimate game with the Iranians? They still have that uranium that is highly enriched. It isn't much of an effort for them to enrich it to the point of it being fissile, where it can be used in nuclear weapons. What happens when all of a sudden we see mushroom clouds sprouting up over the Middle East? Is there a plan for that? Because we keep talking about Trump, and it's almost like it's noise, right? And that's what I'm worried about, is the noise is blocking us from the true danger that's out there, and we're not addressing it. Also, we had folks down in Latin America that were Hezbollah, that were funded by the Iranians. That seems to have been kind of tamped down by the removal of Maduro. So are you discussing these things internally? It's just we're not hearing about it because most Americans don't really understand or care about that. So that's what I want to know is, are you talking about that, and do you have an end game?
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for the question. And I say this as someone who spent years of my career trying to counter Iranian terror groups. I worked in Iraq and elsewhere trying to stop, Kateb Hezbollah, to try to stop these proxy groups, especially those at the direction of the IRGC Quds Force. So I'm certainly very aware of all the damage that has been done, all the lives lost that were killed at the hands of Iranian proxies and their weapons. That is not in dispute here. And the concern about a nuclear weapon is at the paramount, is at the highest regard, which is why, there was efforts before to be able to have negotiations that would have kept Iran at below 4% enrichment, which is now where we see them as at 60% with the ability to go higher very, very quickly. So that was the plan that Donald Trump chose not to be able to continue on, ripped up that agreement. And now we're at a situation where Iran has significantly more enriched uranium at much higher levels of enrichment. So the question is, what kind of agreement? And I think it has to be some diplomatic agreement. I do not think that this can be solved solely through military means. And I think the Trump administration sees that too, because they took action to be able to strike the facilities last year, said it was obliterated, and then now it's saying, no, actually, they're still very much capable of building a nuclear weapon. So clearly, the military only solution is not there. Some type of agreement is needed that would cap the enrichment, that would have inspectors back in. But unfortunately, these are the things that the Trump administration just obliterated. Honestly, that's the word that they used, is they obliterated the agreement that's capped the enrichment. They obliterated the ability to have IAEA and international inspectors be able to do snap inspections of these facilities, and to be able to monitor the progress of what the Iranians are doing. So, I'm hopeful that we could try to find some type of diplomatic agreement again that could reinstate the inspectors that are able to cap the enrichment, and try to be able to have the ability for international monitors. I think that's the only way that we're going to be able to kind of find our way out of this. And as you said, yes, Hezbollah and these proxy groups are a real concern. And that is something that we need to make sure we're tackling, but we have to do it with others as well. We have to work with others throughout the Middle East to be able to do the type of work that we need to. We need to work with other international partners, and right now that is what's being not just strained, but torn apart. I mean, just the level of frustration that I hear from ambassadors throughout the Middle East, let alone our allies with NATO. I mean, it was with NATO that we fought against Al Qaeda in Afghanistan and elsewhere. And then now we're having the president talk about leaving NATO or what's the value of NATO. That's the wrong direction. If we're serious about taking on this terror network, we need to do it with our partners to be able to make sure that America doesn't carry all the burden alone and all the sacrifice alone, but it's also to make sure that we're able to do this in a comprehensive way. And so that's what I find really frustrating about this all is I spend years working on countering terror, uh, building the kinds of international coalitions, and right now we're just alone. Like nobody wants to work with us right now because they see how we're operating.
I guess a lot of Republicans would say whatever you were doing didn't work. Whatever Democrats were doing didn't work, at least with respect to the proxy groups that the caller raised, like Hamas or Hezbollah or the Houthis in Yemen, because, well, they were still carrying out their attacks on Israel at very least. And so something different needed to be done. What would you say to that?
Yeah, look, what I would say is certainly when it came to some of the proxy groups around the Middle East, we did see Hezbollah continue to be strong. There should have been more efforts to be able to take on the ballistic missile challenge, and that is something that I agree with. But when it comes to the work that we're doing, the question now is, are we safer now as opposed to before? And I don't think we necessarily are. I mean, certainly their equipment and their capabilities have been degraded, but they were going to be able to continue this and grow. And as I said, the IRGC Quds Force is even in a stronger position. And now that the United States has gone alone in this process, we now own this. And again, as someone who worked in both Afghanistan and Iraq, I thought we were trying to move past these forever wars in the Middle East. I thought we were trying to get to a place where the United States isn't on the hook to carry everything, and certainly not to carry it ourselves. That is, something that we certainly learned the hard way. And we lost
Also,
thousands of service members in Iraq, in part because we thought that we should stay there and rebuild the Iraqi government. And it gave, Iran a lot of opportunity to be able to hit us. I don't think we should be bogged down there again.
one other thing on the fighting in the Middle East before we get to some other issues and more listener calls and texts. Something seems to be changing for your Democratic colleagues in the Senate with respect to selling arms to Israel. As Politico wrote it up recently, they said when Bernie Sanders moved last April to block a U.S. arms sale to Israel, only 14 Democratic senators joined the Vermont Independent. I'll note that you were one of them. What a difference a year makes. When Sanders objected to another Israeli arms sale this April, 39 other members of the Senate Democratic caucus joined him, a sea change that has raised eyebrows from Washington to Jerusalem. That from Politico. Again, you were one of those 14 voting to restrict arms sales last year. Now there are 40 Democrats. What do you think changed?
Yeah, well, for me, I didn't support providing the particular weapons and equipment that was up for the vote, and that's something that I continue to look through each time, case by case in that way. But in particular, I think what stood out for many of my colleagues is the fact that, again, we're in the middle of an illegal war, and that we are seeing this being perpetuated, in our name, uh, without our say. And I think that that's something that really stands out. So in the same way, what I would say is like, you would see pretty much every Democratic senator right now, if we had to vote on whether or not we'd have a supplemental to to support the military equipment for the United States military right now, you'd probably see across the board senators say no, because we don't want to be given tacit approval and support for a war that, again, we never had the chance to approve. The American people never had a chance to approve. So I think that that's the circumstance that you're seeing in particular right now, which is this is an illegal war, and we're not in a place where we want to support anything that is perpetuating, this illegal war.
One listener writing in has very unkind words for Senate Minority Leader, your party's leader in the Senate, Chuck Schumer, who also voted with the Republicans on this Israeli arms sales resolution. I believe no Republicans voted for it, while 40 Democrats did, and Senator Schumer also voted no. Is it time for Schumer to go as minority leader because he's too out of touch with the emerging mainstream of the party on that and other things?
Look, right now, what I focus on is, how are we trying to stay as unified as possible as a Senate caucus? It's not, we're not able to do that 100% in the way that I would like. But when we are unified, as we have been against this Homeland Security funding, for instance, about ICE funding, you see what we've been able to push together here. I mean, the Republicans were not able to break us through these negotiations. They're going to try to go it alone now, but that just shows how extreme they've been and our unwillingness to give in to what we see as just the lack of accountability when it comes to ICE. So look, Leader Schumer and others, they are trying to figure out how to navigate this, as when the focus is about can we stay unified. I think anyone right now would struggle in the caucus to keep the caucus 100% unified, but we're working on it. So it's not on any one person, it's on me and others as well to try to make sure that we are staying unified. And that's something that I find different in the Senate than I found in the House, in terms of the challenges that we face when coming together. So that's something that we're working on.
An indication of the polarization on the Middle East, with particular focus on the Palestinians and the Israelis. Two texts that came in just about back to back. One writes, could you weigh in on how state universities have been corporatizing and cracking down on dissent by students, especially for Palestine? Person writes, faculty are concerned at Montclair. And the other one that came in just before that says, why does he stand against the state of Israel?
Yeah, look, what I'll say is that first and foremost, everybody in this country should have the right be able to raise their concerns, to be able to have their voices heard. And whether at colleges and universities or in the halls of Congress or elsewhere, I think that that's important. So I'll certainly look into some of the allegations and the points that were raised, but I want to make sure that people have it. Now they need to do it, in a safe manner. We need to make sure that people are safe and that we're not seeing any types of attacks. I mean, we're seeing the rise of anti-Semitism, rise of Islamophobia, rise of so many other types of hate. And that just is something we absolutely all have to stand up against and make sure that we're protecting people's ability to be safe. And look, for me, what my concern is in terms of the policies that we're seeing from Netanyahu, from Ben Gvir and Smotrich, just some of the most extreme viewpoints that we've been seeing that honestly are making it harder for, I believe, Israel to have security and peace throughout the region, for there to be peace across the entire region, for civilians in Palestine and in Israel to feel that the ability to have that durable peace, that real sense of durable peace. I'm not blind to the nuances and the difficulties of that, but I've been very much opposed to how Netanyahu has been using violence as a means to try to bring about his objectives, whether that's in Gaza or right now in the West Bank, as we see huge buildup of violence there, the settler violence and other problems. That is a real problem, and I think I should be able to, and we can be able to, criticize the policies, especially of those of leaders there, without saying that we are, condemning or going up against the people themselves. And that's something that I feel strongly about.
One more follow-up on this from a listener, and then we're going to turn the page and talk about redistricting. A listener asks, in your opinion, should Prime Minister Netanyahu be arrested if he comes to the U.S. and delivered for trial under the International Criminal Court indictment against him as a war criminal?
Well, look, I certainly have real concerns about his policies, and there have been actions that he's taken, on the humanitarian side, withholding of humanitarian aid and others. I don't feel like I can weigh in on exactly what we should be doing in terms of whether he were to come here. But I do think that this is something where it shows, we do need to understand how we can use our engagement in diplomacy to be able to see a change in behavior and a focus on what it is we've been trying to achieve, which is, that sense of a two-state solution going forward, that durable peace. That's where we need to be focused on and thinking about what's actually going to bring that about. What steps can we take to actually be able to give that kind of future that is clearly not the trajectory that we're on now.
More of my questions and yours in our monthly Call Your Senator segment with New Jersey Senator Andy Kim. Redistricting, our next topic, right after this. Brian Lehrer with Senator Andy Kim for another few minutes here on WNYC in our monthly Call Your Senator segment. Let's talk about the midterm elections and the redistricting wars continuing to heat up in both red and blue states to tilt the playing field in one party's direction or the other as much as they can in advance of the vote or for future elections. One text that came in from a listener says, what are you and your party going to do about President Trump and the Republicans trying to destroy democracy? I'll frame it somewhat this way. The Supreme Court's voting rights decision last week amped this up even more by making it easier to eliminate Democratic districts with black representatives. Governor Sherrill says she would be open to redistricting, too, for New Jersey to box out some of the three current Republicans in Congress from the state. Would you?
Thanks for raising this. I've been thinking about this a lot. First and foremost, I'll just say, what a sad state that we're in as a country, that we're, getting to this kind of point. I wanted us to move in the opposite direction. I had wished that the Supreme Court, instead of striking down, large parts of the Voting Rights Act, would instead strike down partisan gerrymandering in our country. I personally believe we should have independent commissions in every single state and have that kind of standard there so we don't see the weaponization. Just the fundamental focus being, that voters choose their politicians, not politicians choosing their voters. I still believe that strongly, and where Trump has injected himself here and is weaponizing this basically to cheat, to try to just cheat and win an election. That's the sad state that we're in right now. So look, for me, the process to change this in New Jersey is very cumbersome in terms of requiring a constitutional change at the state level. It's not something we're going to be able to do right now, anytime in the short term. So right now, I'm going to be focused on the midterm elections, flipping the House and the Senate, restore checks and balances. I think, we'll get a sense of, what all is going to shake out from there when it comes to how, the Supreme Court decision is going to affect redistricting elsewhere and just where the Republicans continue to try to push, as we've seen in Florida. So right now, that's what I'm focused on, the midterms. I hope others are too. Certainly in New Jersey, that's our best contribution to the fight. And we'll see where things go when it comes to redistricting. But, it's certainly something that just breaks my heart. I would hate to see our country move in that direction, as I was hoping to have us go in the opposite direction where, we can further empower our citizens rather than continuing this effort that just disenfranchises so many.
Well, on focusing on the midterms, we're getting a bunch of texts relevant to that. One says, what are the Democrats doing to prevent losing another election to what this listener calls dishonest, corrupt, kleptocrats. Another one writes, what does Senator Kim think about the refusal to release the 2024 election autopsy report? I know that's an issue within the party on the DNC chair, Ken Martin, who's not releasing that autopsy report on what went wrong in 2024. Another one writes, Democrats are demoralized. Where do we look for hope? So you hear the frustration from some of your fellow Democrats in the audience.
Yeah, no, look, and we've all felt that. I mean, I think what we see when we had such losses in 2024, we felt that. But I hope people felt, that the momentum is changing here. I feel more hopeful after the huge win that Mikey had for governor. I feel more hopeful after seeing the huge turnouts to these special elections that we've had in New Jersey and elsewhere that got, Anna Lilia into Congress and others. I mean, just massive turnouts. I'm somebody that came into Congress. I won in 2018 during a midterm of Trump's first term when the Republicans controlled Congress and the White House. And, I saw the energy that propelled me. I ran in a district where the Republican won in 2016 by 20 points, and I was able to pull it off by about a point. So did a 21-point flip in 2 years. The energy that I see on the ground right now is even stronger and even more electric and energetic than what I saw in 2018. Now, granted, there's a lot more frustration as well. I certainly understand that because of just, the problems that we've seen in 24 in terms of connecting. But I think having the ability for having these candidates, really qualified and extraordinary candidates that we're seeing all over this country, many of them not been involved in politics before, coming at this from a different direction. I think that that's really what excites me. And look, I do think the party needs to be very clear about about the different problems that have been faced, and should be transparent about that. I'm not sure exactly where things stand with that report or others, but
well, what would your
I do want that
autopsy be
transparency.
in 30 seconds? What would because I want to get one more caller in here, and I know you have to go soon. What would your top line of a 2024 election loss autopsy report be?
Yeah, look, for me, what I heard and saw was a sense of the Democrats not grasping how much people wanted change, and that there's a broken status quo, not just broken in the political sense. I mean, and certainly a lot of people feel like there's rampant corruption and other problems, which there are, but just the status quo of our economy, of our society, that is creating the largest wealth inequality gap in our nation's history, where so many people feel like they're not being able to live the lives that they want to. Like, that's where the focus needs to be. Yeah. And I think too much of the effort to stand up against Trump was coming across as an effort for us to protect the status quo that the vast majority of people didn't want. I think there's a lot of issues.
Gotcha. Let me sneak in one more caller here. Mindy in Glen Rock, you're on WNYC with your Senator Andy Kim. Hello.
Hi, thanks so much for taking my call, Brian. I love your show. Senator Kim, I voted for you, and I appreciate everything you're trying to do in Congress. You mentioned that you wanted to move forward on foreign policy, and I would love to hear more about the Democratic plan for moving forward on public health. 2 years ago, the CDC was the best public health agency in the world, and as a vet student myself, when I was in college, I was interested in zoonotic disease, and I wanted to work with them because they were the best on global public health issues. Now, the CDC has been destroyed, maligned, shackled. Public health workers who are still there are working so hard to mitigate these draconian changes made by HHS and RFK. This is already killing people. It's already affecting health, outbreak response, public health programs in the states. People are losing health care, access to healthy food, and their public health systems. Do the Democrats have a plan to recreate the U.S. public health system? Because you can't flip it back on. And what is that plan? And we Democratic voters need to hear what these plans are. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thank you for raising this. And it's something that is incredibly important. I'm on the healthcare committee in the Senate, and I've seen, just what this administration has done to gut the CDC and just across the board. I mean, some of the biggest problems that we faced, when we saw what they were doing to decimate healthcare, were like cuts to the NIH, for instance, things that are hurting our ability to lead the research and the innovation of the future, and we're ceding that ground to other countries. So that has a huge impact. So the efforts that we had that had us as the gold standard of the world have now, the credibility has been completely decimated. On the Democrat side, what we have put forward as our plan very much is one about protecting science and protecting, our ability to use science as the guidepost for what we're trying to do at the CDC and throughout in the Institutes of Health and others, and trying to make sure that we are putting forward the funding that is necessary. One thing that didn't get a whole lot of headlines is that we were able to, in Congress, stop almost all of the cuts that the Trump administration tried to do to the NIH in terms of the medical research funding. These are things that we've been able to push on. Of course, we would want more in terms of getting that funding back up and running, to be able to make sure that the CDC has a leader that is a medical professional that is qualified to be able to do this job and is, again, able to do this in a way guided by the science rather than what we're seeing right now, which is RFK Jr. stacking, the Vaccine Advisory Council, with all of his own lackeys, and trying to use that as a means to suppress research and other types of things that are showing, the safety of vaccines, for instance. So those are the types of things that we want to make sure we're pushing on is, making sure we can restore the predominance and preeminence of science driving this, to have that level of independence, to have the credibility of professionals leading these institutions, and then to restore the funding as well as the expertise. When Doge came in and gutted the FDA, for instance, so many of the scientists were taken out. Literally, over thousands of scientists were pushed out from the FDA, and that hurts our ability to be able to do the types of reviews to make sure that our drugs and the drug testing is done safely. These are the problems that we're facing. So we need to rebuild that and rebuild confidence that we can have that type of civil service and professionals in there to be able to do the job. And that's what we're working on towards a plan.
We're at the end of our scheduled time. I would like to ask you one follow-up question on health of New Jerseyans, but if you have another appointment right away and you have to go, I'll understand. So
Okay,
you
well,
tell
let's
me
try to
yes
make it
or
quick.
no. Okay.
Well, let's make it quick.
Very specifically, is there a way you as a U.S. Senator can help New Jerseyans declining to renew Affordable Care Act health insurance policies after the federal cuts? Because apparently a lot fewer people are signing up, a lot more people are going to be uninsured.
Yeah, look, we've already seen over 70,000 New Jerseyans not able to renew their health care through the ACA, and we expect a lot more, unfortunately, to drop going forward. So, look, like this is something that very clearly is as a result of the Republicans' unwillingness to be able to continue the support to these families. And what I find just so painful is that, the amount of money that we spent on the Iran war so far could have extended these healthcare supports to millions of people across this country. So I am continuing to push on this with my colleagues, trying to see if we can get to an agreement to be able to provide some relief, still. And honestly, if you had a straight vote, certainly in the House of Representatives about, extending these supports, it would pass. And that's what I find so frustrating about this. But right now, we don't have very many other tools to be able to provide that support as long as the White House and Congress stand in the way. But I can assure you that if we're able to flip Congress and be able to get the gavels back away from Speaker Johnson and elsewhere, this is absolutely going to be on our agenda to be able to push forward and to try to give people that support and that type of relief that is right now just been decimating. And it's not just the Affordable Care Act, it's Medicaid. And when I go around New Jersey right now, probably nothing that I'm hearing more about than housing costs, gas prices, and Medicaid, just in terms of just the fear that this is sending throughout the healthcare system, that is going to be very widespread and even potentially affect hospitals' abilities to be able to stay open. So there are some real ramifications and consequences to these decisions and these things that the Republicans have put forward, and I hope we're able to stop them.
Our monthly Call Your Senator segment with Senator Andy Kim. Thank you for this. Talk to you in June.
Okay, thank you.
WNYC's journalism and storytelling is heard by millions of passionate listeners. Sponsors of our programming gain our listeners' attention and their respect. Learn about how your organization can support WNYC and WNYC Studios at sponsorship.wnyc.org.